Welcome all. We're going to give it a few minutes as folks are still joining us this evening. Thank you all for joining us. I know we've got some more folks being admitted, but you are in the right place. Thank you all for joining us tonight. All right. Well, I'd like to start the evening with a quick word of warning, and that is that our speaker is in rural Oregon where it is still snowing, and her internet is a little bit less stable than it was earlier in the week. So we are working behind the scenes, paddling furiously like ducks under the water to make sure that we can get as smooth of an experience tonight as possible. We are going to go ahead and start with Kate Markert in just a moment, giving the introduction for the program. And hopefully, by the time we wrap that up, Chris Antemann will be ready to join us. At this point, I'd like to invite Kate to join us on screen.
Okay. Thanks, Erin. Thanks very much. And good evening, everyone. And thank you all for inviting us into your homes this evening. I'm Kate Markert, Executive Director at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens in Washington, D.C. I use she and her pronouns. And as we begin, I would like to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge the Nacotch tank, also documented as the Anacostan, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey. These are the native peoples on whose ancestral lands Hillwood stands now, and also want to acknowledge the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their homes near us today. I invite all of those of you in the DC area or planning a visit here soon to take a moment for yourself in Hillwood's magnificent gardens. They are simply breathtaking at this time of the year. You can see all of the azaleas that are blooming behind me as I'm standing out here on Linnaean. I'm sure that after we hear from Chris Antemann, who is the artist behind the work displayed in the mansion dining and breakfast rooms, I'm sure you'll also want to come to explore the luxury of clay, porcelain, past and present, if you haven't done that already. And it is on view through June 22nd. So there's time to come back and see it again and again. Now, tomorrow, Hillwood's Environmental Action Team is celebrating Earth Day, and we hope you'll join us on campus for practical tips and tours of Hillwood's newest garden, which is below the parking deck. And it's a new native garden, which this is its first spring. And if you're looking for a container garden, please join Jessica Bonilla, who is our Director of Horticulture. She is creating a salad bowl mix or a beautiful container of native plants. Now, all of these Earth Day programs are on site. We also have some fantastic lectures coming up. Next Tuesday, April 26th, I will speak with best-selling author Allison Pataki about her new novel, The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post. The following Monday, May 2nd, I hope you'll join us to hear from Alexandre de Vogüé. He is the manager and the co-owner of the exquisite Chateau de Vaux-le-Vicomte, which is on the outskirts of Paris. He will also offer insight into the fascinating history of the estate that inspired Versailles, and he'll tell us about the contemporary challenges of running such a property. His beautiful new book will be available in the museum shop. Now, both of these programs, Pataki and Vogüé, have sold out in the theater, but you can also still tune in from home. You can also order both publications from the museum shop and request an inscription from the authors. Of course, if you're coming in person to either of the talks, you'll be able to have the authors sign your book that evening. Now, of course, you can learn about these and many other exciting programs coming up that they'll all be on Hillwood's website, and I'm sure Erin will drop a link for you in the chat. Finally, I want to share a few practical reminders about how tonight's virtual lecture will work before I introduce our speaker. Of course, you know your cameras and microphones are off, so please make yourself comfortable. But of course, we still want to hear from you. Please say hello and tell us where you're viewing from using the chat. And finally, submit your questions using the Q&A module, which of course is separate from the chat, just as they cross your mind. We'll get to as many of your questions as possible as we can towards the end of the night. Now, I'm thrilled that we're joined tonight by Chris Antemann. She's an Oregon-based artist known for her work that's inspired by 18th century porcelain figurines. Chris has exhibited extensively in Asia, Europe, and the United States, and her work can be found in a number of private and public collections. For the past 10 years, she's collaborated with Meissen, Europe's oldest porcelain manufacturer, to produce unique and limited edition artworks constructed of groups of figures, reinvigorating the tradition of European porcelain as it has always been manufactured. Her largest installation, Forbidden Fruit, Chris Antemann at Meissen, which was from 2012, traveled to the US for 3 years before a 2019 exhibition at the Hermitage. Chris produced the 2 porcelain surtout de table, which are centerpieces that are in the dining room and the breakfast room. And they're inspired by Hillwood's porcelain collection, and they'll be there during the Luxury of Clay Porcelain Past and Present. Chris's work is also on exhibition at the Venice Biennale right now, and it will be at the Meissen Museum from July 2022 to March 2023. Chris, thank you for joining us tonight. I hope our tech problems are behind us.
Chris, you're on.
Okay. I don't know why. Oh, there I am. Huh. Okay, great. Okay, just how it goes. Snow has been the topic of my life and the saga of these projects, as those at Hillwood know. So it makes sense that it was today, but I was a little shaken by it. So now I'm in a new location and I'm ready to go for it. First of all, I'd love to thank Kate and Erin and Ed for being with me in this today, and Ed, especially for all your help holding my hand through the tech problems. Just take a breath. And thanks everyone for coming. It's really wonderful to know that you're all out there, and I know who some of you are, but I do miss the audience, but I'm ready to go into this. So I have, for the last 10 years, been playing out my own obsession with porcelain through a wonderful experience with Meissen. You can see here some of the details of that obsession: the porcelain figure, porcelain collections, and of course, the 18th century dinner service. I'm known for my porcelain banquets and dinner party vignettes. And over 10 years ago, Leslie Farron and I were running around to all these art fairs And with her support, Less Than Gluttony, my first dinner party, was taken into the collection of the Museum of Art and Design. And 3 years ago, we were actually together in Meissen, the last time we were able to travel. And a special thanks to Leslie for helping to organize everything with this opportunity at Hillwood, and for supporting me and cheering me on along the way. This is where I live, so no surprise. I live at the base of the Wallowa Mountains in Eastern Oregon, and I have my studio up in the woods. It's a beautiful place to work. And when the world shut down around us all, this is where I came back to. And it gave me a chance to stop traveling. And I had been going back and forth between Eastern Oregon and Meissen for 10 years. And just gave me a chance to dream, what would I make next and what would I do during this quiet time? As I said, 10 years ago, I started working with Meissen. And in 1710, Augustus the Strong, this big man on the horse, had his own obsession and self-diagnosed la maladie de porcelain, porcelain sickness, so much so that he needed to start his own porcelain manufactory, Meissen, which is still in operation today, and really the jewel of Saxony. So on their 300th anniversary in 2010, the new CEO had the idea to invite as many contemporary artists from around the world who he felt fit with this porcelain story in some way. And I was lucky enough to be one of them. It was really like falling in love. That's all I can say. I had been researching all things porcelain and Meissen and the history of this porcelain figurine. And I had certainly read a lot about the company, but to be there was at once overwhelming, completely thrilling and exciting, and also a bit like coming home. To find out later that the Antemanns were from an area very near the Meissen manufactory. My first visit, I was taken through the archive. So this is the 300-year-old form archive that they are very proud of, as they should be. Most of the molds from those 300 years still exist in some form. Some were lost in floods or fires, but for many of the forms, they have either a working plaster mold or a plaster model. And just the possibilities, I felt I needed lifetimes to get through the ideas. So back to the figure. On the left, you see just a kind of typical Meissen porcelain figurine stuck on a base because they would be placed on the table amongst the plates, and this kind of rose them up off the tablecloth and gave something to support the feet. And in the middle, my version, not of this particular figure, but of the essence of that figurine. And on the right, you see one of the really famous florals, the German florals that Meissen developed, that I really loved. And actually years before this, I had been collecting prefab decals from the ceramic industry and then cutting and pasting them and dressing my figures in them. So at Meissen, of course, hand painting is the way they do it. And this was one of the early figures that was dressed in the Meissen flowers. And so one of the big topics at Meissen is unique versus limited editions. And as a studio artist in the US, I had only made unique sculptures. The first thing I needed to do at Meissen was figure out, would I make limited editions and what would they be and how would I go about it? So like I had in the past, I was always looking to something, Meissen pieces or some piece that existed, like this apple tree. I happened to find that in a museum when I was there. And I had made trees in the past, but I thought, okay, I'm going to make my own version. In the middle, you see the unique version, which was a way to test would their porcelain, which is fired very hot and shrinks a lot and moves in the firing, would it hold all the leaves and flowers and birds I wanted to pile on it? And then on the right, so yes, the unique one made it through the firing. The test was complete, and I was able to go forward and make the clay model that you see on the right, and making it in this cathedral, bringing the branches together in a cathedral so that they would support all of the weight of what you'll see next. So what happens is they take that mold, that clay mold, and they cut it apart, and then they make plaster molds of every single part. And this particular piece is 84, 85 molds. So then they press this one. These are not liquid cast. These are pressed, porcelain's pressed in there, hollow where it's a larger area, larger piece, and solid like the fingers and the bottoms of the arms and things. And then they deliver all of the parts that are pressed to the studio where the basirers are called. They reconstruct the piece in porcelain. So what we had developed was I would always build the first one, which was quite interesting to build back a puzzle of something that I had made as a unique or as a model, sorry. And so this was one of the first ones I did in the first collection. And then the upper right, you see the finished version. And then onto the painting. Oh, sorry, forgot about the flowers. Next slide. So for this one, the flowers, the leaves are pressed into just a one-sided press mold. I designed the leaves to be ornamental. And then all the flowers are handmade. So Meissen can make really elaborate chrysanthemums and roses and really lifelike flowers. They taught me, and I could do the simple apple blossom. So I made the flowers for this tree. And then after it's fired, we get it back and it's white, and that's when we start painting it. And I didn't have an image of us painting that one, but just to illustrate how the painting happens at Meissen. I paint as much as I can, but like in the case of the flowers or really anything at Meissen, each colleague specializes in one thing that they are really perfect in. And they tried to teach me all of the different aspects. So I was able to do a little bit of each thing. And having had some experience painting, I was able to paint parts, but not the flowers. That was left to the special flower painters. When I think about the 18th century dining culture, which maybe is a term that everyone doesn't think about, but it really led to how we eat today, to the plates being on the table and even the food being already on the table when you sit down to have dinner with friends. But began with where the plates were gold and there was a servant behind every chair. And if you were invited to one of these state dinners, it was an elaborate affair. And you can see in the middle that it's got this huge centerpiece. And this image has been in my mind for a long time and stayed there and kind of resonated. So when I went to Meissen and they were saying, oh yes, you can make whatever you like, the next thing I wanted to make was a chandelier. So the next slide. So using the 1750s version from Johann Joachim Candler, who was Meissen's most prolific and really most well-known sculptor. He could really design anything and designed most of the objects that I look to when something resonates with me in the archive. He usually designed it. And this was one of his chandeliers. So they were able to bring me the parts wet and without the figures and without the elements that were particularly for Meissen. I stripped it down and then put my figures on it and added fruits instead of flowers because this was to be the paradise chandelier. It was a really great adventure. And through that, I realized, oh, next can we now make this huge temple? And the best part of working with Meissen are the people. and the humor and really the family atmosphere that's in the company. Most meet their spouses in there. They take care of each other's children. They know each other very well. And I feel honored that they've taken me into their family. This piece was originally inspired by this Temple of Love, also Candler, of course, that I had seen parts of in the porcelain collection in Dresden, and then researched to find this black and white image from the Frankfurt Museum of Decorative Arts so that I could change it and redo it like I did with the chandelier. But in this case, we didn't have the molds or the models. So we had to start from scratch, and we used plaster and foam and made the shapes and then built this piece together with all of the accompaniments. So I called it Forbidden Fruit because it was all about paradise. And it traveled first, debuted in Germany and then traveled to the US to 6 different museums across coast to coast. And in 2019, had its finale at the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, which was, of course, a huge experience and interesting honor. They paired it with a lot of their prints that were from the 18th century that shared the themes in my work, and other Meissen porcelain pieces that complemented the ones I had made, and was a pretty wonderful experience. I always wanted to make a ship, and I had been thinking about what form. So it had become part of my process to first look in the upper left, you see a piece in the Meissen Museum archive. So these are pieces that the company has used as samples, or to, if they might have a crack or some problem in the firing, and they use it so they know if they're going to build another one. And very often at Meissen, and with porcelain in general, you may have to build one to get another one. And then below that, you see in the archive, the form archive, we found a plaster model, but no mold. So they had to make a mold. So up in the upper right, they made a mold, and then they put the clay for the model in the mold. And you see that below, where I changed it into a ship and added some crates. And then in the next slide, you'll see the figure. So this is the finished piece. And we're still always having this conversation at Meissen between unique and limited. So with this collection, which I called La Maladie for Augustus, I imagined him wanting to hand carry the pieces, although he couldn't because he was so busy fighting wars and everything else. But just imagining a ship bringing precious cargo, storms, and of course, shipwrecks and pirates. So thinking about that, that was the impetus behind this collection. The small pieces in the front are limited 25 each, made to order. And those are all like what I imagined when you get your porcelain at the dock, when you finally have it. The following year, I made Adrift and Afloat. These are a small scale, the small scale boats, like the dinghies that I imagine would be taking from the large boat to the shore, to add 2 more limited additions to the collection. I'm always trying to convince Meissen to let me do things like crazy things, like, can I have that old, beautiful old tureen in wet porcelain and add my figures to it? And this was one of those that they got away with. It was a lot of fun. And also for years, I wanted to do a dessert service or a coffee service. And this just came out in 2019. And it was based on my favorite pattern, which is Gutzkowski. I love it. It's from my favorite time period. Plus it's got embossed flowers and painted flowers and a scalloped edge. So all the favorite things. And then the last project I was working on beginning in 2018, 2019 was exploring the idea of doing a garniture of vases with figures. And Meissen hasn't produced vases with figures since the 19th century. And even then, it didn't happen very often. It just wasn't what they did. They were more focused on vases with painting. And in the next slide, you can see part of the research. So in the museum, once again, the castle vase, then we went into the museum archive, and finally into the form archive to find some of the old forms. We also couldn't find molds for these, but we did find the plaster model. And then that was about the time that the world shut down, and I was actually traveling to Meissen, and I was supposed to be working with this lovely lady, Uta Abel, who helps me build things and do anything in the plastic, clay, and porcelain. So she was left to put the first set together. And on the left, you see the model for the largest vase and a whole cart full of one set. We found our way with video chat and text and some computer drawing programs I had to figure out how to use with the iPencil. That was hard on my brain, but wonderful. And I think I'm happy with the way it came out, and we wouldn't have been able to do it without our 10 years of experience and knowing each other so well and having the trust and belief in each other. Couple details. So you paint the back the same as the front, or not the same, but with as much intensity and as much love. The detail. So pomegranates are not one of the fruits that they paint. It's more apples and fruits that you would find in Germany. So this was really fun for the painter. She had a great time. As I said, it's 10 years, so a decade at Meissen. And for Meissen in the manufactory, they celebrate when colleagues are 10 years in the company, 25 and 40. And by the time you're 40 years in the company, you're usually getting ready to retire, and they have these parties at the company. So I'm excited that I can have my 10-year party there. I can make it there. So May of 2020, things had been canceled for me and postponed, and I didn't know what was happening with exhibitions and projects that had been planned. And of course, I wasn't able to travel. So when I received the email from Rebecca in May of 2020, I was so thrilled. And in exploring Marjorie's collection, it was in a way a lot like the trip to Meissen, even though I had to do it all through books and on the website and pictures that Rebecca sent me. But I'm just in love with everything in the collection. I love the way she talks about collecting, that it's really the joy of it that brought her to it, and then wanting to share it with others when she realized it was something they were interested in. And yeah, I was just thrilled. So in addition to the figures and the beautiful collection of porcelains, I was also inspired by, in the next slide, the plates that Rebecca was able to select these to set the tables around my centerpieces. And we knew this pretty early on. So I was thinking about the colors, and pink and green being two lovely colors to work with, and very 18th century and very French. So that was a thrill. And in addition to the porcelains, the gardens, so spectacular, and especially the characters in the gardens and the Sphinx. I long time wanted to make one, and now I had the chance. I decided the French parterre was the perfect blueprint or stage for this piece, which was intended to go in the breakfast room. I titled it A Stage for Dessert because often in the 18th century, you'd go to the garden for dessert and further entertainment and all the delights after a long dinner. Here's my chance to make the Sphinx. So I made a mirrored pear. These were fun to see since I couldn't be there for the installation. It was so wonderful to get the beautiful images. And I used colored porcelain in the green, the hedges and the ornamental green aspects of the piece. And I wanted to reflect that beautiful green glass in the chandelier, as well as all the leaves and everything, all the foliage from the beautiful orchids. A side view. One unfortunate thing is that the room is closed off for visitors, so you see it from the front. And so this way you can see a little bit of the side, but there's a lot to explore and experience in the piece. A lot of little hidden details. The plate seemed perfect fit. And I had to make my own Diana with a figure peeking around the side. It was a lot of fun making this piece. As I said, I started with the blueprint. So because the garden itself is very squared off, rectangular and hard edged, I softened those edges on the computer and came up with this drawing on the left and then traced it so that I could get this different shapes, because I knew from the beginning it would be quite a large piece to handle as one piece of porcelain, but I wanted to make it in some kind of a puzzle that made sense, that fit with the lines of the garden. So each piece, each of those shapes were made into a mold that you see on the left. Porcelain's laid in there. Basically, it's a 1/2-inch porcelain wall, and then feet are added, and inside that deficit is the structure that gets taken out after the firing, and that's to support the top of that base to keep it nice and flat. And then on the right, you see the slab that is a shrink slab that just helps carry the porcelain, which shrinks 17 to 19% in the final firing. Just kind of keeps it rolling and keeps everything nice and clean and from cracking. So it's a little secret into the how-to. So on the left, you see the final bases all lined up and ready. And on the right, just from above, I think it's a little easier to see how those shapes fit into the lines that separate the water between the fountains and make the different hedges into quadrants. Pressing the Sphinx, just a little something so you can see how the porcelain goes in there. These we can go through pretty quickly, but press the clay in, score it and add some liquid porcelain slip to help it adhere, and then press them together. They're usually left overnight, some not as long, but this one I think was left overnight. And here's the matched pair. So you saw that they're hollow inside. So something that's that big needs to be hollow for firing and safety. So here is the whole garden with everything in there except my figures and all the antics and the little food, the dessert. Here are the two sphinxes. So having the separate parts made it much easier for me to work on the detail, because I could take each piece off and put it on the banding wheel and work on it. And you can see the parts are everywhere. I'm starting to add color and glaze in the kiln. First kiln shot of many. And then this is a very fast, there were many weeks in between with the process of adding the pattern decals and the gold, but I liked this shot so you can see all the parts fit in the kiln. And finally finished in the studio, you can see all those huge crates which are getting ready to be packed. So here's the big mama that I've been dreaming about for years. I've been looking at it in Meissen's museum every time I went in there when I was visiting and working. And on the right, you can see me for scale. So I'm 5'2". So I would say this thing is 10 feet from the table. And this is a little screenshot from the documentary that Meisen produced for me. They knew I was fascinated by this. And even though I'd used the smaller love temple for the piece I made with them, I always had plans for this. And when I can, I look for some 2D documentation about the sculptures that I'm referencing. And in this case, I found this beautiful etching that made it easier for me to move forward into the way that I made the computer sketch. So first thing I did was add on the next 2 more colonnades, and then change the proportions so that it would fit. And I used an old banquet image and cut and pasted that. So I have like how it looks. Then I use images from the original sculpture to plug back in, changing things, adding. It's like a collage on a computer. And then I couldn't figure out how I was gonna know what size to make everything before it would shrink the 19%. So I projected it on the wall in my studio and then traced the drawing, measuring it until I didn't start tracing it until I knew that the measurement was correct, because then I had to pass on those measurements to the 3D. This was the first time I used 3D rendering and 3D printing for some of the aspects. And so here I am in the US. I don't have Meisen's archive. I don't have Meisen's colleagues helping me or a team. It's just me. So I'm using as much technology as I can. So I had to give them that information with the measurements. And this is what he kept sending me by computer, which is a language I don't speak. But had the measurements, I just had to check everything. And then what came out of that 3D printing, it's a plastic filament that prints the forms that you see on the right. And all those dark forms came back like that. I felt like they were flat. So I immediately started adding clay and adding ornament and softening elements directly on the model so that it would be in the mold. And here you can see it half in the mold. I also directly sculpted pieces without having 3D printed, like for this end piece. So you see the original on the left, mine in the middle, and then the finished with the handmade flowers and everything on the right. Here's all the molds drying, and there were over excuse me, over 50 molds made for these 2 projects. And that was, I think it was about 3 months of mold making. Putting the porcelain in the column, lay a porcelain slab in once again, score it, add the slip, add the top and bottom. So this I had to do 12 times because I only had 1 mold for each different column shape, and there's 3 different columns. So it was a lot of repetition for me. I left them overnight, each one. Then the next day I would get them out, and then I had to clean them up, press another one. So it was a lot of physical work and also the repetition, which I have to admit, it made me a little crazy. I'm usually not doing that. Here they are right out of the mold. There's a lot of cleanup. And then the figure goes in the middle one, which you'll see here. So here are a couple of them cleaned up, and on the right, see everything drying with those supports. So I had to cast one of those road cones to make all of the supports. This was another piece. So this, I combined a handmade vase on top, flame vase, and the 3D printed pedestal, and then added ornament to it. I had to make 8 of these. So this was quite a experience to make 8 of the same thing. Very fragile with all their supports. And then for the center dome, this was hand built with slabs on top of the arches that were cast. And then I added the ornament, and on the right, I made the finial, which you can see with some of its supports. And then the figures were added on this, and I put it together after it was fired for the first firing. More firing shots. A lot of kilns were fired. A lot of supports. And then I wasn't done yet because I had to make the longest banquet that I'd ever made. And I have to admit, by this time I was thinking I was a little crazy to take on this huge project, but I was really having a great time. So 24 chairs. Yeah, next slide's fine. 24 chairs, a 5-foot long table, and a 6.5-foot long base, 14 inches wide. And then the figures, which I could show you how I make them, but it's a little bit of a trade secret. So, and there's no time, but yeah, so they're press molded, and I change them and make them into individuals. Finally had the most fun time when I get to add all of the tiny food and little desserts from all these pictures of 18th century drawings of desserts. And cheers, the tiny cheers, I was almost at the end of this part of it. Here it is drying. So you can see this is made in 5 sections because the kiln and also porcelain doesn't really like to go flat like the way these bases are. So it's easier to keep it in a, like, well, this is they're 14-inch square sections, and the middle section's a little larger. And this was designed specifically so that when the columns and the architectural piece is put over it, you don't see those seams. Yep, another firing, more supports, and then snow. Like today, I'm so happy that we still have the connection and I can still talk to you. But we had many, many snowstorms, epic snow this year, which is good for no fire and the drought, everything. But yeah, it was a lot. I think he went the other way, still drying. Oh, here we go. Yeah, sorry, still drying. So I was able to take the individual parts off and work on them. So in this part, I'm putting the color on, and then I'll be glazing. More color. Got it glazed and fired. And now, because I'm not the flower painter, I'm still using these decals that I collect that I just love to use them. It's like collaging. And so for the tablecloth and the rug, everything was done in rose pattern that was stimulated by Marjorie's beautiful dining room. This is how I fire the pieces. So the kiln is on a lift, and I can crank it up and slide the piece in. I have the pieces on a table that lowers and slides in. And then there's just a little picture of how it looks when I get to open the kiln. Each piece, as you see, is fired individually. So here you have 1 piece done and 4 to go. And until that 5th one's fired, I'm usually a little stressed, to say the least. So all the parts laid out in the studio, you can see pretty much everything that goes into making the architectural piece. I had to do a lot of practice runs because these are pinned together, and yeah, it was a new experience. More kiln shot. So the gold firing is always last, and this is real powdered gold. It's almost pure. There's a little bit of flux in it that helps it stick to the piece, but then when it's fired on, you have to polish it down. So this one right here is fired, but you can see the gold is a little bit dry looking, then it gets shined with a stone. Mini Shandy was the last piece I made. That's what I was calling it. Something that could fit in the palm of my hand. And Ed had asked how it was fired, so I just wanted to show a picture here of the little supports that I made for it, for the kiln. And then here it is. And the gold dome. I painted it gold to set off the chandelier. And then you can see another detail of the dome. This is in the studio just after everything was put together for the first time. And there it is, all together in the studio, ready to pack up. Happy artist, relieved that it all was up. And some of the install pictures. I was on FaceTime with Rebecca during the install, and I was really sad not to be there, but it went so easily. And thanks to everyone at Hillwood for putting it together and being so careful. I can't imagine a more beautiful space to make something for. It's such a thrill. Match the pink glaze to the carpet. I want to go in person and see how well I did with that match. And a special thanks to Rebecca for pulling me right up out of the lockdown and giving me something wonderful to work on. And thanks to Leslie Farron for helping to organize it all and really truly cheering me on and getting me through some of the hard days. And my husband and my mom for being with me through this and believing in me and knowing I could do it. On the left, you see the Harbor piece from La Melody collection that Rebecca put into, it's in that cabinet right by her elbow, and she put into the Luxury of Clay exhibition.
Chris, that was delightful. The first time I saw the pieces, I was amazed by the incredible details, and the photos of the work in progress showed me so many more that I didn't even register when I saw the pieces. So I am looking forward to my next visit to look at it a little bit closer and to see all of those in new lights. We have a couple of great questions already pouring in, but we definitely have time for more. So please submit those questions using that Q&A module. That lets me keep track of whether we have gotten to your question or not. Sometimes in the chat, they get eaten by the next fabulous question and I lose track of them. So I am going to dive right in. We have several questions about how you ship these pieces.
I should have shown a picture. So I use wooden crates, as you saw, and they're lined by 2-inch styrofoam, the rigid type. And then the interior is a 3-inch thick, soft, white upholstery foam that is then cut to fit. It's stacked up. So you basically start unstacking from the top and you reveal the piece. And depending on the size, you may have to take off. You always have to take the top off the crate, but you may also have to take off a side. And that's all, yeah, that's something that I learned over the years, but it's like a soft hug for the pieces.
That sounds delightful. And I'm sure that figuring out that perfect method is something that took trial and error, and I presume heartbreak, as with so much in porcelain work. Judy also wanted to know how much these pieces weigh. And I know there are lots of pieces of varying scales.
Yeah. So a piece, like let's say one section of the garden might be between 5 and 10 pounds.
Oh, wow. That's
like
heavier than I would have guessed. That's
and
great.
then the columns, I'm going to guess it's about, thinking about like those barbells, maybe 5 pounds. So the porcelain's quite thick when it's sculpture. If you think about the difference between cups that need to be thin and that can be thin, even at Meissen, their sculptural pieces are quite heavy. It's just stronger and it's better in the firing, takes longer to dry. There's a lot of downsides to it, but they're quite heavy. I couldn't guess how heavy the entire, I was trying to calculate it, but I'm just thinking like a full-grown adult plus a couple of kids maybe. laying on the table. That might be about right. I don't know, 200 pounds maybe?
It's certainly about the
That
right size-wise with that 5-foot long table.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, and that leads me to another question we got. That you talked early on about how the pieces have always had those little foots that help raise the figures up and help give them that sturdy base and get them a little bit further above the place settings on the table. Someone spotted that a lot of those pieces are hollowed out along the base and wondered if those are there for a technical reason, either because it makes the piece lighter or easier to fire or to show off the skill. If it's the exact opposite, it's more challenging to have those little hollow bits.
I think it's probably a design to give it a little sense of architecture, that it has like a little, because they're usually, if I'm thinking about the same thing that they are, it's usually something that is trimmed in gold and then is cut out. And cutouts can encourage cracks. So I don't think it would be a technical thing, but it would help the air circulate and the heat circulate through that area. So I can ask, I'm going to ask and find out. That's very interesting. Yeah. So I don't know, I guess.
I love that. And you do, because it's a design choice, but it's interesting to think that there might be more to learn about how that became the custom that you follow today. Trisha said that there are so many large pieces of your work and that they are just monumental in scale. How do you work on keeping that from drying out as you position and fine-tune the large pieces?
So I use a very thin plastic, like dry cleaner plastic, while I'm building the pieces. And I'm really picky about how they're wrapped up. And actually in Meissen, the lady I showed, Uta and I always discuss this, like how we pack them up for the evening. And we do layers and we do around the bottom. We also will do some spraying, but with porcelain, you have to be careful adding moisture. Things can melt. It's the only way to describe it. Like if you have a dry finger or something, it can melt if you spray water on it. So we try to keep everything the same consistency. I don't have windows open. I don't have any air moving, which is critical. No fans on while I'm building.
Excellent. This may also dovetail to what you just said with the spraying, but you mentioned that the hedges in the parterre, you used green porcelain, and someone wrote in they aren't as familiar with a lot of colored porcelain and wondered if you could talk more about how that's colored, how often it's done, and more about that process.
I think colored porcelain is something that in the last, I want to say 5, but it could actually be 10 years in the US, many young artists are exploring. And I saw some do it and got very excited. Meissen doesn't do anything colored. Nymphenburg does black porcelain that they slip cast or liquid cast. It's stunning and in a matte, just absolutely beautiful. So I had started seeing that, and then I just developed colors. So you dry out the porcelain so it's a powder, and then you add by weight different percentages of colored stain. It's a mason stain, or there's certain ones that are better for body and better for coloring glazes. And then you end up re-wetting it and slightly drying it out. So you have something that feels a little like between Play-Doh and marzipan, because the stain changes the character of the porcelain a little bit. It's a bigger particle, so it changes the fine feeling of it, the soft feeling of it, but it works great in molds. And I knew I wanted to have this really deep rich green as a base.
They are absolutely stunning, and that color is to die for. It was the first thing that took my breath away as I approached that piece.
Thank you.
Kyle asked a question about how the role of these large centerpieces would play in dining, particularly how guests, would they be able to see each other seated across, or how did that tie into the dining culture, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries?
So the piece that I was inspired by, the Temper of Honor, for the Hillwood piece, was actually for Augustus the Strong's son's coronation. And they didn't do anything small or anything by halves. And if you were invited to the table, first of all, the table would be much deeper than what we're used to. So maybe 10 or 12 feet, because it would be so much other stuff. Sometimes they would have real fountains, functioning fountains on the tables. It was all about display and entertainment and to wow the guests. Whether you ate or not, because they often complained. There's some journals from the 18th century about guests at these banquets that would complain. They would go on for 6 hours or so. The food would be cold. You didn't have any way to relieve yourself. You couldn't get up, because if whoever was the hierarchy, the king or emperor, until they moved, you couldn't move. So just that court, I think, people are learning a little bit more about it with Bridgerton and these Gilded Age and these films, but bigger was better. And I think in my case, I have some people who have taken into their homes just the dinner parties, because those are only about 16 inches tall. And then you can see over that, and it's a conversation piece. This piece was definitely made with the museum in mind, and with Marjorie's history of entertaining in mind. And I could imagine if she would use it, it may have been used outside where you were walking around, and then you wouldn't have, because I'm sure a lot of her dinners were about people talking to each other and having conversation, and her skills as a wife of an ambassador, that would be important, not that you were blocked by someone else. So it has sculptural intentions and less functional, I guess.
That is such a lovely image to evoke. I really enjoy that. Can you talk a little bit about the firing process, and particularly how the process of using an electric kiln today compares to those original 18th century not electric kilns?
Right. So if you've seen any 18th century old Meissen, especially sculptures, probably they would have been animals or large tureens. In museums, they probably have cracks. And that's because the controlling the temperature with wood as a fuel is truly just incredible that they did what they did in 1726 and made all those animals. Well, that was the beginning of it, when Augustus charged Chandler to make a pair of every animal known. With the electric kilns, and Meissen is all electric at this, well, they have gas fueled, but they have electric computer control. And then they have some electric. I use electric kilns because I can control it. The computer does the firing for you, and it can go up very slowly and come down very slowly. Porcelain changes shape on the molecular level twice, once going up and once coming down. That's where it would crack, or would like to crack. So we go very slowly through both those phases. And then for my pieces in particular, slow cooling is very important, because I make places which trap heat without meaning to, but because I want these bases to have 2 inches on the side of ornament frame and have feet, look elegant when they're on the table. I putting all that porcelain under there that holds the shape also helps hold heat, but not enough that if I fast cooled it. So it's a very slow process. It takes about 48 hours. And then the next morning I get it out. So it's 60 plus hours from when I put it in until I take it out. And when you have to do one piece at a time, like with the dinner party and wait, those are long hours of stress and worry. But yeah, so Meissen has a down pat. They are really great, and they have certain firings that go faster and other firings go slower depending on what's in there. And they also do a color fire, they call it, for the overglaze, which then it can go faster because it's in a safe, it stays in a safe temperature. And it is a kiln that keeps going, a continuous kiln.
Interesting. That's fascinating. We got a question about one of the figures in the Occasion to Gather, about the figurine standing on the table on her hands and knees, and wanting to know more about that story.
This is my disrupting little maid. And this figure, this character came out of wanting to get the figure off the pedestal. Was one of the first things, was these figurines are going to have their own party and they're going to have a lot of fun at their party. And I think actually the first figure on a table was a male figure on his hands and knees that was on the Lust and Gluttony. But then quickly I started thinking about this maid, like not only twisting and flipping the gender roles, but thinking about class and whose party was it and who was invited and who was working the party in the way of service. And in the La Maladie collection, the little maid shows up as the stowaway. And she is not enjoying her collection of dishes. They're piled all over her, on her back and all around her, because that's her role with the porcelain, just thinking about each different collector or a person who comes into contact with the material, what their story is. But this disrupting little maid has been, is a character that continues. There's also the bored hostess, who is at the head of the table with her party that she didn't really want to have, raising her glass, but not taking part in the festivities, and usually looking out at the viewer with this bored expression. So thanks for noticing the little maids. Yeah, there's two of them on there.
Marcia asked if you could talk a little bit more about your relationship with Meissen and how the pieces that you made in Oregon for the Hillwood exhibition, how those are or are not connected to Meissen, and then when you go back to Meissen, like, are you starting to think about next steps and when you might be going back?
So I immediately sent the pictures to Meissen. I told them I was building these big pieces, and they have been very supportive and really thrilled that I had the opportunity. And I think for them, we made the Love Temple together, and it was we actually made a second version of it for a client. So it's a lot for the production to make something that is that involved, because they're already very busy making everything else, and also making my other collection. So they were pretty excited. And I think I was wondering when I would return to the US before lockdown happened and I didn't have a choice, but when I would start to make some pieces, because I had some other shows lined up, but make some things in the US, how would it feel? And now with the 10th anniversary, it really feels seamless. I'm the same maker. And with what I've learned in 10 years, I couldn't have done these pieces without what I learned there. Truly couldn't. And they were with me because they taught me. And there was certain knowledge in my hands when you touch the porcelain, which I don't know if that makes sense to anybody, but you gain that touch. And that's really through Meissen. So the differences are, it's made of porcelain that comes from New Zealand. So it's fired a little lower and it has a little bit of a creamier look. The flowers are not hand painted on those pieces. They're the decals that are fired on. The gold is very similar. I learned a lot about the powdered gold through working with Meissen. But for the most part, like, I think they understand what I do here helps Meissen, and what Meissen does helps me here. Like, it's a really great relationship across the whole company. And I will have a video chat with the CEO shortly, because I think he is hoping I'll come back, and I want to come back. I'm just waiting until it's safe, if it's ever safe, I don't know. And I have some ideas. We have projects in the works that this down the pipeline we want to make, and some pieces that collectors wish to have made in Meissen porcelain. So yeah, it's pretty exciting. And thanks for the question, because I've missed my friends there. I've missed it so much.
Well, one of the things I really enjoyed tonight is getting that sense of how to tackle a project of this scale, and how to I appreciate you walking us through how to move from one artist and their vision to the team of artisans. I think I counted 20 people in that photograph, and getting a sense of that collaborative process, along with that incredible respect and teaching that goes back and forth, which has just been a joy to share. So I appreciate that. You do kind of touch on what I think is going to be our last question for the evening. And that is, someone with eagle eyes said it's wonderful to look at the harbor figure next to some of the 18th century figures in the dacha, and wondered if you can talk a little bit about Meissen's current porcelain recipe and how that has been shifted over time. No trade secrets, obviously.
Yeah, I actually don't know anything about the recipe, because I don't have that access in the company. And I do have a confidentiality agreement, but I just don't actually know the answer. They do talk pretty openly through their workshops about the mine, that they still have the original mine, and there's 2 guys that are there and they mine it. And I think you can even occasionally go see where they slake it down and where they take the chunks of porcelain and they make it workable. There is one thing that I can say that I learned is never let them give you the freshly made porcelain. You always want the older stuff. And there's certain things they use the fresh stuff for. So they didn't necessarily know in the beginning my process. And I had a bit of a challenge. Then I just said, I'm going to leave this until I come back and come home for 3. I had to come home. I went back and it was perfect. I was talking to them about it. And they said, oh, we'll just give you the old stuff in the future. So that was really a nice thing. But yeah, I don't have those secrets. I would say, just in response to your comment before the question, the collaborative, I didn't know how much I would love it. And now, having worked with Meissen for so long, I really love it. And even though there was part of me that was like, you can do this, you can make this, they taught you, you know what you're doing, I still had moments where I wanted to be in a group. I wanted to be a we are making it, not an I am making it. And even though my name's on the collection with Meissen, and I so value my team and the people I work with, and we're actually called Mini Meissen in the company because we do everything that is usually compartmentalized. We do it all together as a group of about 6 people. And then in the photo, you saw like head of production and the guys who load the kilns, and the CEO then grabbed everybody who was around to come to get a photo. they all touched the pieces. They all dealt with it and helped make it. But there's a really close-knit team and family. So yeah, thanks to Meissen for everything that they made possible.
Can you talk a little bit? You mentioned some of the pieces are from Hillwood are made out of New Zealand clay. How is that similar or different than Meissen? You talked really clearly about the tactile feel. I'm thinking about your really delightful description of how colored porcelain feels like a mixture of Play-Doh and marzipan. Do you feel a really significant difference in the New Zealand clay and the Meissen clay?
Well, I came to use the New Zealand because it's the most like the Meissen porcelain in feel of workability. It's very close. And even in the color, because it has like a vanilla tone to it when it's wet, but it doesn't react the same in the firing. It's different and it's not as brilliantly white, but that's okay with me. That doesn't bother me at all. And I like that it's different, but I wanted something that felt similar. And that's the closest. And I could probably keep researching and mix different recipes, but it's easier to have them make it and deliver it, which was also a problem because people have gotten into ceramics during this time. I don't know if you know that, but it's
You're
made
saying we've
warehouses
moved from baking bread?
overstressed. And there was a point where I was like, you can't tell me that you don't have any more porcelain. But yeah.
Well, Chris, thank you for a fantastic evening and for bearing with us through some connection troubles at the very beginning. I am so grateful that we were able to get that ironed out and just have a wonderful time walking through your work and in conversation. So I'd like to thank all of our audience for sticking with us tonight, for your excellent questions. And Chris, this has been an absolute pleasure. And I look forward to the next time that our paths cross when you come to see just how perfect the pink chairs match the rug in the dining room.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks, everyone. This was really wonderful. And I wish I could see all of your faces, but I know you're there. I'm thinking of you.
Thanks all. We'll see you soon.